Is there any country that's doing clinical trials, not studies, like not observational studies for JHD? We keep hearing of a trial that is going on in another country, but isn't available in the US. Can you tell us what you know about this?
Okay. I good question, and I actually don't know what trial that question is referring to. I did a bit of Googling, I couldn't find it, and I must say, I think the answer is no. I don't think there are trials, certainly not of disease-modifying treatments in juvenile HD. There might, in some countries, be small-scale, local investigator-run trials of potential treatments for the symptoms of JHD. But as far as I know, there hasn't been a clinical trial in juvenile onset HD. It's something that we're working hard to change. And it was a big thing, for instance, for Roche, that they wanted to have a plan for getting tominersen into trials in JHD as soon as possible if there was any sign of a good signal from adult onset HD patients. The JHD population is a very difficult place to test drugs. Although it's urgent that we do test drugs and bring treatments to kids with JHD, it's a very tiny population. It's a very small number of people, which instantly creates problems for proving that drugs work versus don't work. They're kids, so they can't, in many cases, consent for themselves, even if they're reasonably well. But many of them are not well at all and would lack the cognitive abilities to understand. So they would have to be placed in trials by their caregivers. And there's nothing wrong with that. That happens all the time in pediatric diseases. But it creates an additional kind of level of difficulty for proving that a drug is worth making that leap. The other thing is JHD is a very tough nut to crack. And anyone who knows kids with JHD will know that it's very rapidly progressive in most cases, and the symptoms that might be easy to control if they presented in adult HD, in JHD those symptoms can be really difficult to treat. So we know that the brain of a young person with JHD is a brain that's very difficult to rescue. So I think that's why we haven't seen those trials yet. One of the things that we're moving towards is having at least evidence that the biomarkers that work in adult HD also work in juvenile HD. And with Lauren Byrne, we've been and Pegnopoulos, we've been measuring this protein called neurofilament in the blood of JHD kids, as well as kids who don't have JHD. And we've shown that neurofilament is massively elevated in those kids, which means that if we can show that neurofilament is a good biomarker in adults and predict success in a drug trial in adults, we could potentially very quickly make the leap into kids using neurofilament as a kind of biomarker to show that we're doing the same thing in those kids. And the drug companies are super enthusiastic about it, but it's a really difficult thing to accomplish. I think the only drug so far that has come close to being potentially potent enough to test in JHD would be tominersen. And actually, if you look at the way that the tominersen Generation HD1 trial panned out, that made many of the adults worse who were taking it. So in retrospect, we're actually glad that we didn't go early into JHD, because you don't get a second chance with a juvenile HD brain. And it's a bit like what we were saying earlier about advanced HD. Those brains are so fragile that the last thing we want is to try something in good faith, but then end up realizing that we actually made it worse in a way that's can't be retrieved. But equally, the current situation where we have nothing that works is not exactly satisfactory. We feel the urgency and we feel the pain. Yeah. And it is happening. It will happen.
And piggybacking on this, it's an integrated question, but recently Katie and 7 other amazing moms spoke with the FDA here in the US. And what would you see as the greatest challenge as far as getting access to clinical trials for children?
That's a great question. The greatest challenge. My problem is that I can't choose one because there's so many challenges of equal magnitude. I think it's a combination of the drugs not being good enough yet to justify the risk of going into kids with JHD. And we know that the drugs that we've had, which had the greatest potential, have so far turned out either not to work in adults or to have produced, in some cases, harm, which if you think about that happening in a JHD brain, it would have been much, much worse, and everyone would have wished that they hadn't done it. And so that's the biggest one. The biggest one really is scientific and biological. We don't have drugs that are good enough yet to justify that risk, but we're close. And I think there are drugs that are being tested now that I think we just need to get a bit more information in adult disease about the balance of risks and benefits, but have a very low threshold for then going into JHD. So something like the PTC drug, which is a pill, and it lowers Huntington, and if you stop it, it stops lowering Huntington pretty quickly. That sort of drug I could see as being a potential candidate for being the first one to test in kids, with a specially designed pediatric protocol that's minimally invasive and is based on making sure that the kid is not experiencing additional suffering that might be due to the drug. Really good measurement of biomarkers and other ways of figuring out as quickly as possible whether the drug's working. And I could see that happening. And then it's a case of making sure that the regulators are going to agree in advance. So there's certainly a case of lobbying the regulators. In Europe, you're not allowed to develop a drug for an adult disease without a pediatric development plan if that disease is also known to affect children. And that plan can be something like, this drug would be impossible to test in children, so we do not intend to. But if your drug would be possible to test in children, you have to basically declare in advance what your plan is for moving as quickly as possible into children. Again, it comes down to this question of, is it unethical to put children into drug trials, or is it in fact unethical to deny access to drug trials for children with a serious disease?
Right.
And I come down on the second side, but history of every regulatory framework is the history of the country and the culture in which it arose.
So accurate.
We're pushing against heavy doors.
And I do think that one of the loudest points made, because I was watching the session, one of the largest points made was the difference between adult onset and youth onset, however you want to say that, just the differences in the symptoms and the severity and literal where one has a symptom, the other does not. Yeah. And so it's, I think, not to speak for them, but I think that some of the things they mentioned is that like they need their own studies to happen that are more geared towards their children's symptoms, like in other pediatric diseases that maybe don't have an adult form, because it's different. And so that's kind of, I think, some of the frustration.
Exactly. So some of it's like organizing, right? And we haven't, because there's so many people with adult onset HD relative to the kids, all of the emphasis on drug development has been to say, this is a population in which it's relatively easy to design trials, so let's do that. And actually, I think what's happened is that along the way, people forgot to keep up with getting things set up for kids so that you could very rapidly activate juvenile or young person trials. That's changing, and Lauren Byrne has this project called Join HD. She's HDO that has the Join HD program, but Lauren is leading it. And Join HD is a bit like a registry or enroll or cohort study, but it's specifically targeting kids with JHD. And it's about studying them. There are blood samples involved, but it's also a kind of clinical thing. And it's about getting the numbers together so that when we do have trials, we'll be able to start running them as efficiently as possible.